Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we are going to be diving into another winning list video, which is going to become a series on this channel, where we look at how to create a winning list without playing a single game, and that kind of entails the creation of the list, the thoughts that go behind, what units to put in the army, and then of course checking on deployment and things like that on Tabletop Simulator and just getting a good idea of how the army feels before playing a single game of Warhammer 40k. Last time we looked at the Warhost, and this time around we're going to be looking at the Ynnari. I've been wanting to do a follow-up video on the Ynnari ever since I did the initial kind of, overview of the detachment and so forth. And I feel like I have enough experience now with the Ynnari, both playing games on my own and, kind of watching other people play the Ynnari to get a good grasp of how the detachment works. So, Ynnari, of course, is the most popular detachment right now because, at least in competitive play, that is, because it is so strong. And what makes it strong is its domination of primary objectives, which a lot of other Eldari detachments have a lot of issues with. If you look at literally any other Eldar detachment outside of Spirit Conclave, they do really struggle with primary. Now, I actually think that the Ynnari is a better and more well-rounded detachment than the Spirit Conclave as well, because when you look at Spirit Conclave, and we will eventually do a video on this, but the way you want to play that army is with a lot of Wraith Blades, Wraith Lords. You want to just kind of stack stats against your opponent and use, kind of that Eldar trickery in the form of battle focus to make your opponent, kind of make bad decisions, stuff like that. But the issue with that detachment is it sometimes struggles with secondary, and it's very passive, right? It kind of just sits on objectives and doesn't do much else, whereas Ynnari has options. So, having said that, let's go ahead and dive into the Ynnari. So the first thing that you need to think about with the Ynnari is the Warlord, because it is a requirement to have either Yvraine or the Incarn as your Warlord. So that's the first choice we have to make. So we're going to have some auto-includes in this list. Like pretty much every Ynnari, list out there, there's going to be either an auto-include of Yvraine or the Incarn or both. Now, in my personal opinion, I think they're both auto-include. Yvraine allows a unit to, do a lot more damage, and, having the ability to, essentially revive bodyguard models makes it hard for your opponent just to whittle the unit down. So that means that the unit is essentially immune to most indirect fire in the game. At least if your opponent is bringing a moderate amount of indirect fire, the unit will be relatively protected against it. The other thing is the Incarn, right? So aside from Yvraine, you have the Incarn. Now, the Incarn is essential in this list, and I'll talk about why in a second, but essentially, he helps you with the primary objective game, and he makes it even harder for your opponent to make decisions about what units to kill, how to kill them, and in what phase. So, first thing we're going to do here, we have our list right here. We've started out, we have the Ynnead detachment, and we're going to just go down here to Epic Heroes. We're going to put in the Incarn, and we're going to put in Yvraine. Now, as per which one is the Warlord, of course, the Incarn is kind of going to have to be the Warlord, and that's because of the possibility of secret missions. Now, this is not going to be around forever, obviously, and sometimes, depending on what the mission pack looks like in June when they come out with it, Yvraine might want to be the Warlord. This is something we can easily switch, though, but for now, we're going to put the Warlord as the Incarn. Essentially, though, it shouldn't matter, and I'll tell you why. It's because in a Ynnari list, you should be dominating on primary objectives. So that means with the first couple of turns of the game, we should ideally be building a list that essentially jails our opponent in so that they have a hard time scoring primary objectives in the first couple of battle rounds. Okay, so we have that taken care of. So what this means is we're essentially working with 350 points less, but we already kind of have our Warlord set up here, and we of course have Yvraine to buff a unit. Now, what we're going to do with Yvraine is right off the bat, we're going to decide what we want to do with her. So the thought process of where Yvraine wants to go kind of goes like this. If you want to use Yvraine more as a counterpunch type unit that is going to, you know, use lethal intent to get up the board and hit a unit in combat, which means you want to be more aggressive with Yvraine, we're going to put her with Incubi in a Venom. And what that allows us to do is it allows us to use her kind of aggressively to charge into enemy units. Now, this isn't a bad way to use her, but I will say this, you are spending 75 points or 85 points on Incubi. I think actually, let's check real quick on Incubi how much they cost. I think they are 75. Yeah, that's right. In Dark Eldar, they're 85. So you're spending 175 points plus the cost of a Venom, which is 70 points, to essentially kill a unit. And the units they can kill really are only infantry. And I've learned through my experiences with the Ynnari that this is maybe not the most cost-effective unit for trading. Now, sometimes you just have to spend more points to kill something in order to score an objective. And that's true of any game. If you guys have, you know, played a consistent amount of Warhammer 40K, you don't always make good trades point-wise, but the trade-off is that you're scoring an objective. Like you're scoring overwhelming force or you're scoring storm hostile objective. You're getting points on the board, and that is, you know, absolutely essential. The other thing that I think a lot of people need to understand about the Ynnari is it is a detachment that will lose almost all of its units by the end of the game. If you pilot this thing correctly, you will probably lose most of your army by the end of the game. And what we're talking about here is maybe you have, out of the full 2,000 points, maybe you have 400 or 500 points left at the end of the game, but your score should reflect very highly because you have used those units correctly and you've, you know, basically prevented your opponent from going anywhere on the table. So we can use Yvraine aggressively, or we could use her more defensively. I personally think that we need to decide what the biggest weakness of the detachment is and use Yvraine to kind of counter that weakness. So I'm going to let you guys in on something, and you guys probably know this, those of you who have been playing Ynnari, but the biggest weakness of the Ynnari is going to be big combat armies, armies that revolve around close combat. And that's because lethal intent only procs in the shooting phase. If your opponent is World Eaters, if your opponent is orcs that, you know, don't really have a lot of shooting necessarily, or if your opponent is just going to try to get into combat with you, with, you know, kind of Blood Angels or Dark Angels, whatever it is, and they don't plan on shooting a lot of your units, that means you are going to have less of an ability to score on objectives, and also you're going to have, you know, less of an ability to perform in close combat accordingly. So what we're going to do is we're going to decide what type of unit we're going to put with Yvraine that boosts our ability to prevent combat from taking place. Either prevents combat from taking place in that our opponent doesn't want to charge into Yvraine, or they just don't want to mess with that unit that you're, you know, kind of fielding. So there's only really one choice here, and that is Incubi. So we're going to actually, just the first thing we're going to do in the list is we're going to put in Incubi into this list. So we have Ynnari Incubi, and I think Incubi are the best choice for Yvraine. I know some people run her with Kabbalite Warriors and stuff like that. I don't really like Kabbalite Warriors too much. I run them in Dark Eldar. In Dark Eldar, I think they're necessary because they're the only sticky unit and stuff like that. But they're kind of expensive when you know, run them with the Venom and stuff like that. So, and typically their weapons, just for me personally, seem to bounce without, you know, without power from pain. So you have to understand that in a Ynnari detachment, you're not getting power from pain. You're not getting the ability to reroll hits with pain tokens. So that's why I don't really tend to like Coblites that much. But anyway, so we have Ynnari Incubi here. We're going to improve them to a 10-man squad. And the reason for this, we're going to have the Demiclaves. And by the way, if you guys are wondering, what's the reason of putting the Demiclaves on there? Well, it's because the single blade has the same stats as the you know, regular clave, but it has the option against wound 1 models of doubling its attacks and also getting twin linked, which is what you want against hordes and stuff like that. So it's not the best weapon. You know, it's no Exarch weapon, that's for sure, but it's still better than the regular thing. So we're going to have a unit of 10 Incubi. They're fairly cheap for 10 models. They're only 150 points. I expect that if the Ynnari get nerfed in points, Incubi are going to be the unfortunately are going to be the target for this. Okay, so we have a squad of 10 Incubi. So now what we have to think is, does this unit adequately protect us from getting charged? And the answer is maybe, right? If the unit has less than 10 models in it, we can use the Ynnari detachment ability to give them fights first. So if you guys don't know this, if you have damaged units in your army, at the start of the fight phase, you can choose one unit to get fights first. It has to be damaged though. Now, this is fine, and I've seen people run it like this without the Visarch, but a smart player is just not going to shoot these guys. They're not going to interact with them if they know that you can get fights first if you have a damaged unit. So what we need to do now is we need to add in good old the good old Visarch, right? We need to have the Triumvirate. And this is kind of fluffy as well. Again, this is a massive amount of points that we're putting into these 4 units here. The Visarch, the Ynnead, Yvraine, and the Incubi. But they are essentially going to form the core of our army, though. The core of our army that is very good at preventing combat, keeping objectives in your control, and preventing your opponent from overrunning you on the battlefield. One of the big problems with Ynnari is that if you lose a lot of units at once, you're not going to have the gas in the late game to survive. So you're not going to be able to score in the late game, which can lead to your opponent making a very big comeback, right? I've played a game where, you know, I dominated the first part of the game, and in the late game, I really didn't have quite enough tools to, you know, kind of close out the game, and my opponent almost caught up. So you don't want to allow that to happen. And I did make a few mistakes as well. So you want to be in a good position so you're not kind of, you know, stuck at the end of the game with almost no units and no points. Okay, so these are the core of the list. What else needs to be in the list for them to be successful? So I talked about earlier the ability for your opponent to move around the battlefield. So there's 2 units that come to mind that are really good at preventing your opponent from moving. And those are Striking Scorpions and Warp Spiders. So what we're going to do, and I've had a lot of success with triple Warp Spiders, but we may not add the triple Warp Spiders right away, right? We might just do 2 Warp Spiders. So I'm going to go to Infantry, and I'm going to go down to Warp Spiders here, and we're just going to put 2 units in here. Now, I think the best thing to do with these is a lot of people are going to say, oh, put the power blades on them, right? Put the twin link power array on them. Usually when you're using these guys to move block, you're not going to charge, right? 9 times out of 10, and sometimes, yes, you will just be able to do normal move, but that's not the typical thing, right? Normally, you're going to have to use the flicker jump. So I like to just put the Spinneret Rifle and Death Weavers on these squads, right? Of course, they have an Aspect Shrine token as well. And that's because they're not going to charge, and your opponent is probably going to kill them. And they're not going to get a real chance to strike back. Again, your opponent is, we're assuming here that your opponent is going to be able to play around the Ynnari in some way, shape, or form. We're assuming that this is, you know, you're kind of more in a competitive environment. If you're not in a competitive environment, any type of research that you do on building a strong list, you're probably going to be able to do pretty good in your local game store anyway. So we're going to assume that, you know, we're going against players that are aware of the Ynnari by now, that before their tournament, they at least looked up their rules and are actively trying to play around your abilities. So we're going to put 2 Warp Spider squads in there. Warp Spiders, I'm going to do a video a little later on about what units I think are going to get nerfed in the coming month, in June. I think Warp Spiders get nerfed a tiny bit. Maybe they become 100 points. I still think at 100 points they're fantastic. So, all right, 2 units of Warp Spiders, and we talked about Striking Scorpions. We're going to put 2 units of Scorps in here. And Scorps are a little bit expensive, right? That is true. They are expensive, but they add a whole lot of depth to your early game. So what they're going to allow you to do is they're going to allow you to jail in your opponent if you go first. Going first as the Ynnari is great because you get that, kind of early lead on your opponent. You get to, block them in, hem them into their own deployment zone, and Scorpions are going to be able to help you do that. Now, if you don't get first turn, Scorpions are still a really good melee threat, and they can still move block certain aspects of your opponent's army. Because you have the ability to use battle focus tokens that can just make them immune to Overwatch, you can put them in positions that you wouldn't normally be able to put other units. Like, for example, I play Dark Eldar as well, and what I can tell you is that when I'm not running Reaper's Wager there, it's a little bit hard to get screening units into position. Like Mandrakes are hard to position because if your opponent has anything that can overwatch them, they're pretty much dead. So unless you're running Reaper's Wager and you can spend a CP to make them immune to Overwatch, it's hard to actually, hem in your opponent. So the Ynnari, they really, again, they want to be able to move block your opponent's stuff. So use that battle focus token to do that. Okay, so we have our 2 units of Striking Scorpions. They're going to go with the Biting Blades. I think the Biting Blades are the best choice, but honestly, I've heard people make an argument for the Claw. Either one's fine. It doesn't really matter because for the most part, these guys are going to be move blocking. They're going to be involved in making sure your opponent can't move around. Okay, so we got our 2 units of Striking Scorpions, 2 units of Warp Spiders, so that kind of solidifies our early game move blocking ability. Scorpions can kind of go up and move block turn 1. Warp Spiders can go up and move block in the subsequent turns. Okay, now we might add more Warp Spiders and Scorpions as needed. I don't think we need more Scorpions, but we might add some other things here to score secondary objectives, which we will also need. But the next thing is we need to try to take care of units that are going to be able to threaten and absolutely destroy our main units. So the Incarn, Yvraine, and the Incubi. So we need to decide what units can scare off our opponent's big threats so that they don't go after the Incarn, so that they don't go after Yvraine. Or if they do, they're going to get punished for it. So those units are going to be either Howling Banshees or Fire Dragons. Howling Banshees are very good at taking out heavy infantry, power fist wielding things that have a high toughness, high durability. Howling Banshees are girls for that, right? So we're going to add 2 units of those in here. And again, we might add more depending on how many points we have, but we have to be kind of conservative and, we're kind of running out of points here. So 2 units of Howling Banshees, we're going to give them the Executioner. That's going to allow them to pop 3 wound models. Things like Blade Guard, things like Aggressors, anything that has a high toughness value and 3 wounds is perfect for these girls. And they even trade pretty well into Terminators, but, no one really brings that many Terminators anymore. Even so, they can be good against those units. So we're going to bring 2 units of those in there. Okay. All right, so that covers our anti-infantry, at least in combat. Also, Howling Banshees just have fights first base, so they're able to heroically intervene, and they're able to help protect certain units in our army. Next, we need to deal with heavy units that are not infantry, so things like vehicles, things like monsters, that can really ruin our day. The thing about Yvraine's unit, Incubi in particular, is they're really good at dealing with infantry, especially with rerolls wounds, but if they have to go anything, up against anything that is a tough monster or a tough vehicle, they really have problems. They really have issues, especially against things like Chaos Demons. Chaos Demons, why, you ask? Well, because Chaos Demons have really high toughness, they have an invulnerable save, and they have a ton of wounds. So even with all of our attacks, even with the Visarch, Yvraine, and all that stuff, we're going to be wounding on 6s re-rolling is still really tough to bring anything down. So we need something to deal with these targets. So Fire Dragons are going to be the obvious choice, right? Fire Dragons are very deadly with lethal intent, we can move them into a better position to also hurt our opponent. So if our opponent wants to stage a little bit too close to us, fire dragons can come forward and just absolutely melt whatever that is. So there's a couple of different options that we have with fire dragons. One is we put 2 units in a wave serpent. I actually think this is a pretty good kind of method to be able to essentially force our opponent back into their own deployment zone, and that's exactly what we're actually going to do. So we're going to put 2 units of fire dragons in here. We're going to give our Exarch the fire pike. That is the obvious choice. I've just found through playtesting that the fire pike is better on the battlefield. On paper, the Exarch's Dragon Fusion Gun looks good because it has that, melt to 6, but in reality, it usually just doesn't do that well, right? Having the extra range on this is just much more versatile and much better. Also, having the extra strength on the fire pike makes it so much easier for the fire dragons to get wounds through. So we're going to add 2 of these units in here. And like I said, we are going to add a wave serpent. So what's the point of the wave serpent, you might ask? Well, the point of the wave serpent is that so that when we make our lethal intent move, we only have to target the wave serpent with it and not the individual fire dragon units. Because what we can do is we can lethal intent the wave serpent up the battlefield. We can choose to drop off 1 fire dragon unit if the target is not that, much to deal with, right? So if the target's like a dreadnought, for example, we don't need 2 fire dragon units to kill the dreadnought. We only need 1. So we can drop off that fire dragon unit. They can get out of the transport because the transport hasn't moved yet. We've just lethal intended during your opponent's, end of their shooting phase. They can move their full distance, advance, become immune to Overwatch if they need to, or get the extra +2 from the battle focus token. And then they can kill that dreadnought. What we can do then is we can move the wave serpent back to safety with the other unit of fire dragons, and we can do it all over again the next turn. However, if your opponent has something really big, like a Great Unclean One, or, I can't remember the special character Great Unclean One, but the big guy with the head cowl, we might need 2 units of fire dragons to deal with that. So in that case, both units of fire dragons would come out, and then we could move our wave serpent to safety. Having the wave serpent is actually a great tool because we can also use other units in our army to then hop in the wave serpent. Something we can do that's really cool is if our opponent is a primarily shooting army and doesn't have a lot of close combat, which isn't, too apparent, but Imperial Guard, for example, what we can do is we can, after we dump the fire dragons out, we can load up the Ynnari Incubi with Yvraine and the Visarch because the wave serpent has a carrying capacity of 12. And they can get in it, and then they can do the same thing the next turn because we're not having to use our Incubi as a countercharge unit. We're not, going to heroically intervene with them or anything like that. So we can use them more aggressively. This works great against armies like Hammer of the Emperor, who can move through terrain and stuff like that, right? And just want to shoot you. They don't want to engage you in close combat. A Hammer of the Emperor army can be very deadly. So having the option of this wave serpent who can lethal intent up, drop off their payload, then literally scoot back to safety, and then load up again is really good. It's just like you keep reloading it and it just goes downfield over and over again. And it puts your opponent in a position where they can't really do anything without some serious reprisals. Okay, so we have our wave serpent here. We're going to give it the Bright Lance just because that's what you give it in the Shuriken Cannon. Okay, so what do we have here? We have a core of our army that is very good at, kind of being able to stop close combat from happening, right? The Incubi, Yvraine, the Visarch has that fights first, always turned on. We have our 2 Warp Spider units, our 2 Scorpion units that are very good at controlling the early game, the battlefield in the early game. We have our Wave Serpent with Fire Dragons in it, which can also reload after the Fire Dragons are done, so our opponent doesn't have an easy time with vehicles and monsters going up the battlefield, especially against demons where they fly. That's the key right there, because remember what I said in the early game, you're going to be using striking Scorpions and Warp Spiders to control the battlefield, but flying demons don't really care, right? Flying Bloodthirsters or, Be'lakor or any of the, greater demons aside from the Nurgle one, right? They don't care about striking scorpions or warp spiders, move blocking them. So having something that says, yeah, you may not care about these guys, but you're certainly going to care about 10 fire dragons getting, pushed into you. That's going to be a big deal. Okay. So we have that. So what else do we need in this army? Well, if you guys notice, the thing is that when we have striking scorpions being used to move block, and we have warp spiders being used to move block as well, we may not have anything on objectives. And that's going to be the key. We need something on objectives, and we also kind of need something to screen our backfield in case our unit, or in case our opponent, has something that can deep strike. So against certain types of armies like Hypercrypt Legion, or perhaps, Grey Knights, right, with their teleport strike, we need something to kind of prevent that from happening. Now, there's a couple of options that we have here as the Ynnari. And we could, if we wanted to, right, we could use, I wonder where they are. Here they should be here. Oh, they're in battleline, right. So we could use Cobalite Warriors for 110 points, right? Cobalite Warriors are, fairly mobile. They have 8-inch movement, which makes them better at, kind of getting up the battlefield. They have sticky objectives. They also have long-range weapon options, so you can kind of just poke one out, fire a Dark Lance, and not really worry too much about repercussions because they're way in the back and our opponent already has a ton to deal with. Or we could choose Storm Guardians. So it's really up to you guys what unit you choose. I tend to be a fan of Storm Guardians, and I'll tell you why. Storm Guardians, to me, are a little bit better because they have an invulnerable save. They have a tiny bit of Overwatch, which it may not seem like a lot, but it is actually, I think, mathematically better to have a unit that can, for example, kill a unit of Tempestus Scions coming in. So if your opponent has, small units of cheap infantry that can deep strike in, it might be worth it to have a couple flamers in the unit. Also, Storm Guardians, as well as Cobalite Warriors, they both have sticky objectives. So if you do need to leave your home objective in the late game and your opponent doesn't have anything that can come back there, at least you can still control your objective. So you're getting more value out of this unit than, say, a unit of Guardian Defenders. So my personal pick is Storm Guardians. I'm just going to pick Storm Guardians because I like Storm Guardians. As you guys know, I'm a big Storm Guardian fan. I always have been, and I really love them. So we're just going to go with Storm Guardians. We're going to put all our special weapons in there, right? They also get fusion guns, which are really good. We're going to put our power swords in there. And we're going to have our unit of Storm Guardians. Okay, so now we kind of have the backfield covered. We also have a battle line unit that can do things like set up flags, which is a big thing, right? Being able to set up a flag on an objective is pretty good if you do get that mission rule. Okay, we have our Storm Guardians, but now it comes to the point in the list where we probably need some expendable units to try to mess with our opponent a little bit and to go on objectives. So, I'm a big fan of Corsair Void Reavers. So, Corsair Void Reavers are 60 points. They're super cheap. They recently got access to Battle Focus, so now they can use Battle Focus. And what they do is they also have Scout. So, essentially what you do on the first turn is, if you do get first turn, when you scout up your Scorpions, they move block your opponent. They maybe charge a vulnerable unit, depends on how your opponent deploys. Your Warp Spiders position themselves to do the same thing the next turn. Your Void Reavers are going to be the expendable units that are going to go onto the objectives to force your opponent to have to deal with them. So we're going to put a few Corsair Void Reavers in our army. Now again, I don't think you need too many of these units. I recently had an army with 3 of these. I think 3 is too much now in hindsight, and I would just rather take 2 units with the power swords. Give the Felarch the Mist Shield. You do not have to, if you really want the unit to die, you don't have to use the invulnerable save. You can just use their 4+ armor save. And we're going to give it the Neuro Disruptor, and we're going to give the unit a blaster. So Blaster, just because it does a little bit of extra damage for you, right? So, well, I think it's a good argument to have, right? Blaster or Shredder. Shredder is very random, and I don't really like that. I like the Blaster because it's able to deal with like little fast moving things. Like if your opponent has a Viper or, you know, a land speeder or something like that, the Blaster can actually perhaps even kill it if it gets lucky enough. It's probably not going to kill it, but it's going to do enough damage to whatever that is to where your Corsair Void Reavers have the option of using grenades to finish it off. So they also have grenades, which is nice, right? So if your opponent doesn't deal with these guys, they can do some serious damage, whereas a Shredder, your opponent can just ignore it, right? Like if your opponent's Marines, they're getting a 3+ armor save against it, maybe even a 2-up, depending on what units are going out there. You're really not going to do any damage with it, whereas the Blaster can do some significant damage into any target, as long as it wounds. Okay, so we have our Void Reavers here, and they're just going to be our expendable tokens to just kind of use to throw on objectives. If our opponent shoots them off of it, we can sticky the objective. If our opponent charges them, you know, they're expendable enough to where they don't really matter, and we're not going to try to get charged anyway because we're going to be move blocking, and we're going to be making sure that that's hard for our opponent to do. So there we have our Corsair Void Reavers kind of set up here. Okay. So we have 305 points left. So what we have to think about is, do we have enough here to kind of make the list work? And I actually think that this list pretty much works as is, right? We really don't need that much more to this list to make it better. But there are a couple things we can do, right? Like we have to think, do we have all of our damage that we need, right? Are 2 squads of Fire Dragons enough? I'm going to say they're enough for this list. I don't think we need a 3rd squad of Fire Dragons, so we're not going to have them. But what about Dark Reapers, right? What about Rangers? Do we need a little bit more move blocking? Would another unit of Striking Scorpions be effective in this list? So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to address a problem that the Ynnari have that other detachments don't. And that is Ynnari don't have access to Eldred. They don't have access to extra CP. So what I'm going to think about is how can we make this detachment more CP efficient? Now, if we go to characters, there are 2 units that help do this, the Autarch Wayleaper and the Autarch. Now, the Autarch Wayleaper can only go with Warp Spiders and Swooping Hawks, and we don't want to add value to units that we are going to just have die, right? Warp Spiders are not going to be charging into combat. So the Wayleaper is kind of wasted in that way. And it also, I'm not a huge fan of the Wayleaper because when you're using it with Warp Spiders, you're rolling an extra dice for your flicker jumps, and that could just kill an extra Warp Spider. So I don't like the Wayleaper really. But the Autarch, I'm a huge fan of. Now, let's go ahead and put an Autarch in here. We actually have enough for 2 Autarchs if we wanted to. So we can attach these to Fire Dragons. We can attach these to Howling Banshees. I think Howling Banshees are the best units to attach them to. Again, the Striking Scorpions are going to be sacrificial, right? They're going to be units that are probably going to die within the first couple turns of the game. So, and they also don't do a ton of damage against the units that we're going to need to hit hard. However, Howling Banshees hit very hard against wound 3 units that have, really high toughness, things like aggressors, Blade Guard veterans, and stuff like that. However, they don't hit hard enough to kill the entire unit, and they don't have grenades. So what the Autarch does is the Autarch gives them access to grenades. He gives them a free stratagem so that they can use, emissaries if you need, if they want to reroll ones to hit, which is extremely good on Howling Banshees. Gives them a lot of reliability. Kind of gives them the same ability as Aspect Host, where they can reroll, ones to hit. And he also has a really powerful combat. So he has a Star Glaive. If you look at this, it's Strength 6, AP -3, Damage 3. That has the same profile as the Executioner from the Howling Banshee Exarch, except it doesn't have anti-infantry, but it has extra attack. So this is a really good option for Howling Banshees. I really like this. And because you can't take Jane Czar in a Ynnari detachment, this guy is going to be your go-to. So we're going to give him the Dragon Fusion Gun because that's the best option for him. Just quite simply, we're going to leave him with the Starglaive. And he is pretty cheap. He's only 75 points, and he really increases the amount of damage the Banshees can do against a lot of different targets. Either grenades or emissaries if you need, or both if you have the extra CP, right? So he can really boost the damage of that unit. Now we have 2 units of Howling Banshees, so we're just going to have 2 units of, we're going to have 2 Autarchs. Now some people might disagree with this, and they might say, well, Proxy Hammer, you can only use one of those a turn, right? Because if we look at the rules here for them, right, where is it? Here it is, the Path of Command, right? Once per battle round, one model from your army with this ability can use it when the unit's targeted with a stratagem. And then you reduce the cost of the stratagem by 1. Okay, so a lot of people are going to say, well, that's a waste because you're never going to use these in the same turn. It doesn't become efficient anymore. Well, I'm going to ask you this, right? What happens to a Howling Banshee unit after it charges in and kills its target? What happens in the next turn? Well, usually your opponent's going to kill that unit of Howling Banshees, and the Autarch may or may not survive, right? Well, if the Autarch survives, it can fade back. Maybe it lives. Maybe it doesn't, right? This way, if you have 2 Autarchs, the next turn, you can just simply reload another unit of Howling Banshees and charge forward with them and kill another unit, right? And then that way you always have, at least for 2 turns, which is probably enough, you have 2 units that can reliably kill its target, instead of only 1 unit that can reliably kill its target and 1 unit that may kill its target. Because remember, Howling Banshees are really good for 90 points, but they're not going to totally dominate a unit on their own. They do need a little bit of support. And I think the Autarch is the perfect model to support them. And it's only, for these 2 characters, it's only 150 points, which is not a lot. Okay, so we have our CP kind of, generators here. We're going to at least get 2 free stratagems out of these guys. Probably that's what it's going to end up being, which is not as efficient as things like Eldrad, I understand, but they will give us a little bit of a break on CP when we want to use them on our Howling Banshee units, or we want to throw a grenade or whatever. Alrighty, now the next thing we have to think about is we have 155 points left. That's not a whole lot of points, but we kind of already have our army set here. What are some little extras that we could add in our army to make it a little bit better? Well, personally, I think that we kind of have a really good setup here for the most part. But we could add more warp spiders. Right? We could have triple warp spiders. So I really love warp spiders. I think they're one of the best units right now. And I think that having an extra unit of warp spiders would be a really good kind of addition, because that means that we have an additional turn of move blocking available to us if we need it. So if our opponent has a ton of different units, or our opponent has a way to get around us somehow, we can move block them in an extra area an additional turn. So I think we're gonna add another unit of warp spiders here. Let me actually add the Howling Banshee aspect tokens here to the Howling Banshees, so that when we convert this to Tabletop Simulator, it will show. Same thing with the Fire Dragons. So now we have 60 points left. It's not a lot of points to really spend. So let's look at our options here. So our first option for 60 points is maybe we look at some of the enhancements for the Autarchs, but, honestly, I don't think the enhancements for these guys, we can't even take them. Never mind. We can't take any enhancements for these guys. So that's a no-go. Even though we're in the, Ynnead detachment, apparently the enhancements just aren't available for the Autarchs. Yeah, I guess not, right? Because I think they're specific to the Dark Eldar units. So let's look at that. So we have the Ynnari Archon, the Ynnari Succubus. The Ynnari Archon's too expensive, but we can have a Succubus that just kind of runs around and does stuff, right? A single Succubus might be okay. I don't really like the Succubus though. Even if we give it, like, let's assume, right, we add the Succubus in here and we give it the Morbid Might, which if you look at the enhancement, it gives it reroll wounds. It's wounding on 3s, and it's going to get 6 attacks, which are anti-infantry 3+. I don't know. I mean, we could do it, right? It is an option. It does give us that exactly 60 points that we need. But you have to understand, like, what kind of value does this actually add to the army, right? And in my opinion, it doesn't really add any value. So we're going to get rid of the Ynnari Succubus. But you could do it. We could also go with a Warlock Skyrunner. Now, if we go with a Warlock Skyrunner, it's a mounted unit. We could do this. It gives us an extra kind of thing to go around and do secondaries with. And give it a Singing Spear. We're 15 points down, but it really doesn't matter too much if we are. So that's another option. I think if you're running a lot of Wraith Infantry, this is a really good idea. You want more of these if you're running Wraith Infantry. Like, I have another list where I don't have this big block of Incubi, and instead I have 2 smaller blocks of Incubi and Venoms. And the Warlock Skyrunners in accompanying with the Wraith Lords are really good. But we don't have that type of list, right? So the Warlock Skyrunner doesn't add a huge amount of value to this army. We can add another unit of Corsairs, right? Corsair Void Reavers, they're really good. Another unit of those, I mean, we may not need it, but it may be nice to have another unit to, like, put in reserve, like if we get the mission for it. Or we could just do Rangers. So it really depends. This choice is up to you guys. Now, personally, I actually own some Rangers, and I would probably just put in some Rangers here if it was me. But there's a lot of little options you can do for 60 points. So we're just gonna throw in. I think we already have enough infiltration. I think we're gonna throw in Corsairs. We're just gonna throw in some Corsairs. Couple reasons for this: their battle line, right? So they do benefit from all those mission rules that affect battle line units. They have a blaster, so they have a little bit more damage. They have power swords, which are, you know, again, they don't do nothing. Like, power swords are pretty good in combat. You know, these guys are re-rolling hits against units on objectives. So I think they're just going to be better than Rangers for the most part, but that's just my personal take on it. In this particular army, we already have a unit that does infiltration. We have 2 units of Scorpions. I think that's quite enough. And, you know, we're just going to use these guys for objectives mostly. We can use them for secondaries. They have Scout 7, which is really good as well. So this is a unit that we can really leverage in a good way. I don't think we need 3 squads of them, but again, we have extra points, so we're just going to throw them in there. So this is our army. So I think this is a pretty balanced list for the Ynnari. If you guys are looking for, you know, kind of a strong type of Ynnari list, I think this is it. My personal take on it is Ynnari is a strong enough detachment where a lot of things can work. You know, there's Big Dick Ynnari, which involves, you know, using a raider with a lot of Incubi in it, maybe the Visarch, and just kind of going forward and throwing them out there with lethal intent and stuff. I don't know how competitive that is, but it's really, you know, does a lot of damage. And then there's Ynnari where it's like MSU, tons of MSU out there. There's no Death Stars. You're just trying to control the board as well as possible, score a ton of secondaries. And then there's this kind of balance list that we've kind of struck here where we have a unit that we have some expensive units like the Incarn, Yvraine, the Visarch, and the Incubi, but supporting them, we have a lot of MSU, and we're kind of just trying to cover all of our bases with what we might face in a competitive situation, like a tournament or something like that. Okay, so we have our list here. Let's go ahead and take it to Tabletop Simulator and see how we deploy on the battlefield on different layouts and things like that, and see if we can get this thing effective or if we need to make some changes. Alrighty, everybody. So here is the list in its full glory. we are coming in at 16 different units, which is, you know, about standard, I think, for a Ynnari list. We have a pretty large army as far as the amount of units we have. Now, we're going to take this list and we're going to set it up on the tabletop. So I already kind of set it up for you guys here, and I have set up an opposing army here. This is going to be a typical Hammer of the Emperor, Imperial Guard army. Of course, these all aren't going to be commanders. They'll be different tanks, right? Hellhounds, Rogaldorns, etc. But this is kind of a standard setup, I think, for at least most Imperial Guard players on this terrain layout. They're going to have some tanks back here, tanks back here. And the reason for this is because, as you guys probably know, Hammer of the Emperor allows their tanks for a CP to move through ruined walls. Now, that would be a big deal against other factions, but against the Eldari, it's not that big of a deal because we have units that can screen them out. So, basically, let me go through the setup with you guys and explain why we set up what where. Now, the game plan here is to basically block our opponent off from being able to move, right? So, if we go first, well, first of all, let's just address the elephant in the room. These Scout Sentinels aren't going to be able to use their scout move because we have blocked them off with Infiltrate. Now, our opponent could have Gaunt's Ghosts, but wherever they put their Gaunt's Ghosts is only 5 models, and we can easily just kind of go around that with the Striking Scorpions. And, you know, if we get the chance to, 5 Striking Scorpions can pretty reliably take out Gaunt's Ghosts, at least in my experience, right? You can just charge in a bunch of sustained hits. You're wounding on 3+, and most of them are going to go down. Maybe, you know, maybe Gaunt doesn't go down, but most of them are going to die. Even with fights first, they just don't have the AP really to, like, really kill a lot of your models. And they definitely don't have the attacks to be able to do it. Okay, so we deployed our Striking Scorpions on the flanks, and the reason for this is we're not going to necessarily try to control objectives with them. We're really just going to try to move block, right? So if we go first, it's a really easy move block, right? Scout, we can't really scout at all because they have units here, but we can possibly kind of go over here a little bit to the side, and then we can get in front of this ruin here, or we could just simply block this area off with an advance, right? So we can block this whole area off. What this allows us to do is this makes it so that it's impossible for, maybe this is a Hellhound, right? It makes it impossible for the Hellhound to pull one of these where it blasts forward, like with move, advance, roll, and all that stuff. Remember, they're advancing 6 inches in Hammer of the Emperor. Prevents them from just shooting these units off the board, right? Also, being positioned here, just if we go second, prevents them from doing that anyway, right? They're just not going to be able to move past this quadrant to get line of sight onto things like these Corsairs, or, you know, this one over here isn't going to be able to move like way over here and get line of sight on our Warp Spiders, really, right? Stuff like that. So if we go second, the prerogative is just spread these guys out a little bit so that these tanks can't move forward that effectively. Same thing over here. If we go first, we try to move block this area so that our opponent can't just go through here and just start blasting away at things. Or we just move over here, right? I think this is actually the better maneuver, just to spread them out along this line, because then their tanks can't go like this, which would be very devastating, right? With move, and everything like that, if they just went like that and just killed the Incarn. So that's our goal. We're going to just prevent them from being able to fit inside this footprint here so that they can start shooting us. That's the idea. And we can definitely do that. Now, while these Leman Russ commanders are moving, they do ignore engagement range, but they don't actually ignore your physical model. So they can kind of squeeze through gaps, but typically speaking, Rogaldorn's Imperial Guard vehicles are rather chunky. So it's kind of hard for them to actually do that. And if they do get first turn, right, they get their command point, but they can't use their command points for everything, right? They can't use advance and shoot and move through walls in the same turn. So that's another thing that, you know, you can kind of do to, unless they have Lord Solar, which they could have, right? But I don't know if they take Lord Solar or not. Right? Even if they do, you have something to block them physically off the board. You can easily spread these guys out right here, right, along this line. Just make sure you're just out of 9 inches and just spread your scorpions out like this. Okay. So that's why we got those scorpions there. We do also have our Corsairs that can use a scout move as well. And these guys can kind of act as a pseudo move blocker in case your scorpions don't have the full range of motion, right? So like these guys can move up 7 inches. So you can actually use these guys to move block this area so that your opponent can't get a good angle on the warp spiders, right? So if you move these guys up 7, watch what happens here. If you know your opponent's going first, you guys move 7 inches up, right? And let's say you kind of spread out a little bit. And these guys honestly should have been a little bit more spread out to begin with. But if you move them like right here, your scorpions are kind of like right here, blocking this area off. Your opponent really, with 20 inches, he can't even move his full 20 inches, right? With his move and everything. So it's not going to be a good time, and also has to spend probably 2 points for pivoting. Opponent's probably not going to be able to get line of sight on these warp spiders. It's going to be difficult for him to do that. And it's going to cost 2 CP anyway, right? And actually, depending on what type of tank this is, if your opponent's doing this with like a Leman Russ battle tank, Leman Russ commander or something like that, it's kind of a good trade. Because if you trade warp spiders for something big like that, it's pretty good. Because you could lethal intent the craft, you know, the wave serpent. You can lethal intent that up, drop at your fire dragons. It's an easy kill for your fire dragon squad, and then you just kind of hop back in, and that's all you have to do. You could also charge it with your Yvraine's unit. Very easy kill. So your opponent's probably not going to do that, but we have a plan just in case they do. I know that some Hammer of the Emperor players like to just go full throttle first turn and just try to wipe you off the board, especially against an Eldar player. You know, basically Imperial Guard players are kind of conditioned against Eldar to go in hard, go in fast, kill as much as you can, because they're just going to run out of steam, which is fair, but we just have to, you know, kind of learn how to prevent that. Same thing here. We're going to put these guys into a position where they can be on the objective. So we're just going to move these guys forward, scout them forward. And this actually gives us a huge advantage, because what it allows us to do is sticky the objective, right? And our opponent has to commit a lot of OC onto this objective to be able to actually take it, right? Because they have to kill our scorpions, they have to kill our, you know, Corsairs, and if they don't kill all of them in one shooting activation, then we can just kind of hide behind here with fade back, and we can control this objective. If they do kill everything, but they're unable to actually get physically on the objective, we can always sticky the objective, right? Now, here's the kicker, right? We can also teleport the Incarn in if they do kill everything. So let's say their Leman Russ or their Rogel Dorn comes in here, guns blazing, kills the striking scorpions. You know, let's just say they roll pretty good, kills all the, you know, gunners with all the, you know, kind of heavy stubbers and stuff. We could just move the Incarn in there, right? And then, of course, we still have lethal intent. We have these warp spiders right here. Guess what the warp spiders can do? They can also move on to this objective, and then we're out OCing our opponent. So the goal with the Ynnari is, if they do wipe out your units on the objective, you have 2 units that can jump on, the Incarn, and typically speaking, a unit within 12 inches like warp spiders. Same thing here, right? These warp spiders, there's a reason why they're positioned here other than being able to move block if I get first turn. It's so that they can just lethal intent onto the objective, right? So they can get that objective and control it. And same thing over here, right? We have these warp spiders positioned for a reason. Okay, so we have our Storm Guardians here. They're going to provide sticky and probably screen, you know, if our opponent has some Tempestus Scions or any kind of annoying deep strike. We can just kind of spread these guys out here and just call it a day. Now, the Yvraine brick. A lot of people are wondering how to position this thing. So in this kind of game, you really want to make sure that your Yvraine brick is being on the offensive, because your opponent is really never going to actually charge this unit, right? They're going to shoot it to death. So what we're going to make sure we do is we're going to make sure that if we get first turn, we really move block this area, and we move Yvraine's brick into this position behind the ruin. That's turn 1. Turn 2, we use our scorpions to, or no, not scorpions, excuse me, our warp spiders here to move 24 inches or 26 inches up, whatever we have, the space for. 26 is ideal, but if they have something to overwatch, probably just 24, but that's okay. We can still move block this area right here. And once we move block this area off, we can safely move Yvraine's unit behind this ruin here, right? And Yvraine's unit is pretty fragile, but it's not as fragile as you think against light fire. So a single tank commander, a single Rogue Eldorn can do a lot of damage to the squad, but you can always pop -1 to wound on them, right? Which is I can't remember exactly what the stratagem's called. I think no, it's not called that. It's not emissaries if you need, but it's the -1 to wound strat. You can throw that on them, and then you can go ahead and survive a lot of those lighter attacks. And they have a 3+ save. They're in cover, right? So typically speaking, you're going to be able to survive most of it. Again, it depends how good your opponent rolls, but you also will be kind of move blocking as well. So as long as you move block properly, you should be able to hide these guys. And then once they're hidden behind here on turn 3, you have the option of just wiping out whatever's behind here still. Right? You can charge these guys forward into here or charge them around and just really just give your opponent a hard time. And guess what? Even if the squad dies, you're controlling the midboard. You're controlling all the objectives, either by stickying or just having units in a position to essentially make it impossible for your opponent to actually get through you. So that's the goal. And that's kind of going to be the goal against any army is you're going to try to, attempt to move block them right away. So let me give you another example. Let's say they go first and they kind of move their, sentinels up here. They're like, boom. Maybe they move up to do sabotage or something like that with a sentinel. I don't know. They move up here, right? And you have this kind of screened out area. They move 9. I think they move 10 actually. So see here, that's actually not enough to actually be able to see past this, but that's okay. We have a sentinel right here, and we have our scorpions right here. Now they really can't move their Leman Russ battle tanks anyway past this, right? And by the way, we would, in our scout phase, we would have spread these guys out a little bit more, but just so they're all 2 inches away from each other. And again, it's not going to be perfect, guys, but that's essentially the idea. We just want to block them from being able to, actively get in this piece of terrain. And then can our Leman Russ commander move fully within this? No, right? So therefore, not going to be able to see to the other side. And they're either going to do one or two things. They're going to stay here turn 1, or they're just going to try to push as much tanks into this area as possible because they don't want to get move blocked. But unfortunately, I have bad news for this Imperial Guard player. If they do that, right? If they just move everything kind of in the center here, and they're just like, scorched earth, we're going to just kill as much as we can. There's still a very easy way to move block these guys, and it's with these warp spiders, right? And all 3 of these tanks next turn will probably die if your opponent does that, right? And if you guys can't see it, I'll just show you. I'll just show you real quick how we're going to kill those guys, right? We have an Autarch in here. We have Banshees can move out. We have a Wave Serpent who has 2 Fire Dragons. We move that out. We have the Incarn. Boom. We have a squad of Banshees here. Boom. And we have Warp Spiders, which can kind of move block and do some extra damage as well. So we have a lot of, we have a lot of firepower, to put it bluntly. And if our opponent loses this whole section of their army on turn 2 or our turn 1, it's over. Our opponent really can't recover from that, right? Even if they go guns blazing and they move their other 3 tanks over here to try to deal with it, that's fine, because now we have this side of the battlefield fully under our control. We don't have to worry about that. We have that full Yvraine brick who can now screen behind here, control this middle objective, and our opponent's basically screwed, right? So our opponent really can't do that maneuver. It seems like a good idea. A lot of players would be like, oh, what if they just rush you? How do you deal with that, right? Well, if they rush you with too many units, then you could just kill them. And that's the great thing about Eldar. We do have pretty high damage as far as, you know, kind of our abilities and stuff. Emissaries of Ynnead allowing us to reroll 1s is really strong in combat. I know it may not seem like it, but a squad of Howling Banshees with an aspect token can push through some good damage against certain targets. Okay, so yeah, that's what we can do in response to that kind of maneuver, is we can just collapse on that side of the board and we can just wipe them out, right? That's the benefit of being fast moving. On this side of the board, if they decide to do the same thing, we can kind of do the same thing over here, right? Because we planned it accordingly. Yes, we don't maybe have the Howling Banshees in the greatest positions to deal with that. Yeah, they're kind of out of range there. But we can certainly move the Autarch up, and maybe he can throw a fusion gun in there, which should hit. It should wound because we have that aspect token, and that's doing D6 plus 3 damage, hopefully. We can throw a free grenade. We can move our Storm Guardians up into position. They have a couple fusion guns that might help out. We have Yvraine's Brick, which, by the way, if our opponent kills one of these units, Yvraine's Brick does this, moves forward, right? We're going to move forward 9 inches with the aspect token. Or not aspect token, excuse me, battle focus token to here. We're going to move again, and then we're going to charge whatever comes out. So if our opponent decides to do this kind of thing, you know, move their tanks out like this, which they could do. They could all advance. Remember, Hammer of the Emperor, everything can advance 6. Right? If they move out like something like this, they're absolutely wrecked. Like, this would be disastrous for the Imperial Guard player, you know? Because watch. 9 inches. Boom. Oh. That's okay. 9 more inches. In the movement phase. Boom. And then these are going to be dead, of course, because I don't know why our opponent wouldn't shoot at them. Or we'll just move, if they don't die, we'll just move them out of the way. And chances are we've put enough targets out there where our opponent has to shoot something and kill it. And then we just charge in. We pile in 6 inches with our battle focus token, and we get everything in close combat. Yes, Hammer of the Emperor can, you know, fall back and shoot. But at this point, you're going to be in combat with something, right? And the tanks can't fire into combat. They can just fire while they're in combat. So, for example, if this tank decided to fall back, right? This vehicle cannot shoot into this close combat unless this tank also falls back, right? And at that point, you've kind of already won. Even though the Yvraine Brick is now kind of exposed to 3 tanks. And by the way, one of those is probably dead, right? I mean, this tank right here, probably fried. This one's probably heavily damaged. And that's just because Yvraine rerolls wounds, right? So it can reroll wounds against this target, pretty much easily kill it. Kind of a fun thing about Leman Russ commanders and tank commanders is they're also characters. So, you know, anything that affects characters will affect them. I don't know if the Visarch has, I think he has an epic character, anti-epic character. So that doesn't work with him, but he still does good damage with rerolls wounds, devastating wounds. Like, this thing is just probably toast, right? With all of these attacks, rerolling wounds, yeah, it's probably done. But yeah, anyway, so that's not a good move for your opponent, right? So you're basically exerting a lot of control over your opponent's maneuvers, and they may think it's a good idea just to rush you, but we have so many tools at our disposal to just counterpunch super hard, right? With any of our units. Big Yvraine Brick, Ynnead. By the way, if our opponent moved like this and shot like this, you could easily just do this with the Ynnead, right? Boom. You could move that Ynnead right here if you wanted to. As long as they didn't have anything left to shoot, the Ynnead's totally safe from Rogel Dorns or Leman Russ commanders in close combat. No, they're totally safe. Plus, these guys are advancing, so they're not going to be able to charge afterward. Okay, I hope this gave you a good idea. Let me show you one other thing real quick, just in case you guys are wondering about the warp spiders. I've shown this in previous videos, but you might be wondering, oh, how do you move block with warp spiders? Well, you just flicker jump, right? You go 26 inches, That's going to be right about there, right? That's 25.5. So you have a little bit of room to maneuver, and you just kind of go like this. Right? You just get up there, nice and close. An inch, 1 inch, 0.1 away from the wall, so they can't just engage you, but you just go like this. And then basically your opponent has to go around, and they're forced into these choke points. So what your opponent is forced to do at this point is either come through here, this way where the sentinel is, just straightforward, which again, we've discussed this. That's a death trap because we have units that are just going to be waiting in the wings to pick them up, right? Or our opponent goes over here, right? And that, again, that's another death trap. So we have both side lanes right here totally controlled. We do not need to control the middle. That's not something we need to do right now. We will do that after we've cleared a flank. Right? Okay. I hope that makes sense to you guys, kind of how to set up the army, how to play it on the battlefield and stuff like that. Let me know in the comment section if you guys have any other questions. Basically, though, we're trying to set up a situation where our opponent really can't do much against us. Now, this is an Imperial Guard opponent. If we were going against something with any kind of combat ability, we would use these banshees defensively. So as soon as we kind of position up with our, kind of units of striking scorpions and stuff, we can position our banshees in such a way, like, well, it'd be behind this wall, right? If I could get them there. They'd be, okay, it's not going to allow me because the deployment zones are up. But we could get these banshees right behind this wall, and then as soon as anything comes behind here, we could kill it pretty easily. By the way, sentinels, either scout sentinels or, kind of armored sentinels, are really vulnerable to Howling banshees. It doesn't seem like it, but with an autarch and the, Howling banshee exarch, you can do some really serious damage into scout sentinels and sentinels. Scout sentinels only have a 3-up save, and we're either reducing them to a 6-up or a 5-up save with the banshees. So typically speaking, after shooting a fusion gun into it, charging it, it's probably going to die. Okay. Yeah, or get pretty close to dying at least. And same thing with the Scout Sentinel over here, right? So we can deal with these Scout Sentinels with Howling Banshees. It's not difficult. If our opponent tries to, kind of come in, if we saved our aspect token, we can also just overwatch with the autarch for free, get a free overwatch with the automatic 6 to hit with an aspect token, and that will do some serious damage as well. So again, this army is all about exerting control over our opponent to where nothing is a good move, right? No move our opponent makes is going to be without consequence. And you guys as an Eldar player, if you're really struggling in your games and you're like, man, I lost that game really hard, think about what you could have done better to make it harder for your opponent to make a decision, right? Or think about ways in which you could force your opponent into 2 bad decisions, like if you do this, this will happen. If you do this, this will happen, right? And of course, sometimes there's a better choice in there, but your opponent's not always going to be able to easily recognize it, or, your opponent does recognize it, does it, but it's still not ideal for them. It's just the better of the 2 poisons, right? It's like pick your poison, kind of. That's how we should be playing Eldar. And also, by the way, if we didn't want this squad to come over here in any capacity, we could also just do this. Right? We do have 2 units of warp spiders. We have 3 of them on the battlefield. So we could do something like this and just kind of spread our warps out over here. And now our opponent really can't do anything, by the way. Like, our opponent just is absolutely screwed on this side of the battlefield. Like, they can't move over here at all. And then on this side of the battlefield, if they only put out like 1 or 2 vehicles, then they're losing their control on the center objectives, right? Okay, guys, and that's if you go second. I'm just saying if you go second. If you go first, it's a really big advantage because the striking scorpions can just move block for you at that point. Okay, that's all I got right now. Oh, one more thing before we go, just to let you guys know. There was a reason, of course, we brought the Wave Serpent with the Fire Dragons in it and didn't just deploy these guys on foot. In most lists, I think deploying them on foot is fine because you don't have lethal intent. When you have lethal intent, this is some crazy shit you can do, which is probably why it's going to get nerfed. But check this out. So your opponent kills something, right? Let's say that, you know, they kill something, they move their Leon Russes here. Right, we discussed how bad of an idea this is, but this is really why it's a bad idea. Some people might say, oh, but Proxy Hammer, you know, to move out the Wave Serpent, you have to move, you know, whatever, 9 inches plus 4 inches, and then you're only getting, you know, maybe you're getting Star Engines for an additional 4 inches. That just puts you right here. Fire Dragons get out. They're still out of Melter range, so they're not going to do too much, right? Although, as we all know, Fire Dragons, even outside of Melter range, can do pretty good work. But this is just the Lethal Intent move. Right? This is just Lethal Intent. So we could dump out our 2 Fire Dragons after we move again. Or, because this is just the Lethal Intent move, we can dump our Fire Dragons out like this. I'll show you guys. Right? We dump them out of the Wave Serpent. I like to dump them out in 2 lines, just like this. Makes it simple. We can make one of them immune to Overwatch. We can't make both. So a good idea, actually, is to make the first squad here immune to Overwatch. And then put this unit kind of back here. I guess it doesn't really matter. Something is getting probably Overwatched, right? So you do have to kind of be careful. Maybe just one squad is fine. You have the other squad tucked away behind here, right? That's if they have the CP, right? Because if they don't have enough CP to use whatever they're going to use, then that's fine. So you dump these guys out 3 inches. You move forward 7 inches. Guess what? Guess what these guys are doing as well? They're also move blocking. So not only are they going to pick up these tanks, but they're also going to prevent them from moving farther up the battlefield. Boom. You still have Melter range on the Exarch. You still have Melter range on all these guys. These guys can easily just clear out one of these tanks. And then, like I said, this is only the Lethal Intent move. So what we can do is we can just move this Wave Serpent back where it was. Right? Boop. With a Star Engine maneuver. And now we have a Fire Dragon unit that's ready to go the next turn. This Fire Dragon unit can throw its grenade, can shoot, and just do a ton of damage for the cost. And then when our opponent tries to break through, they can't because you're blocking it. Okay, so somebody asked me the other day about that, about, you know, what should I do? Should I use a 10-man unit or a 5-man unit? This is why the 5-man unit, I think, in Ynnari is superior. Because of the fact that you have that Lethal Intent maneuver, you can go here, drop them out, move back. Or, if you really want to get at your opponent's stuff back here, right? We were, what, right here? Remember, Wave Serpents have fly. So if our opponent had something like this hidden behind here, we could also do this. Star Engine, move 18 inches on average dice. Okay, it's going to do that, but you guys get what I mean. We're going to put it like in this position, move the Fire Dragons out, and they just blow this thing up, right? So there's a lot of cool things we can do. I don't know if that's the best maneuver right there, but it's something that you should tell your opponent about and say, hey, if you shoot at something, this Wave Serpent with double Star Engine, right? Because it's once per phase, you can double up on Star Engines if they're in different phases. So Lethal Intent is 1 Star Engine. That's in your opponent's shooting phase at the end of the shooting phase. And then 1 Star Engine in your opponent's, you know, whatever. Right? It's not going to allow me to move past there because it's the deployment zone. But anyway. So yeah. So let your opponent know that. Let it cook inside their mind. Let them think about it because nobody likes something in their deployment zone taking their home objective. So, you know. And the great thing is Wave Serpents are flying vehicles, so they could just fly over all of the enemy models, which is awesome. All right, guys, that's going to be it. I hope that kind of gives you a good idea of some of the stuff you can do with this army. Again, a lot of the Ynnari playstyle, it takes a little bit to get used to. You have to play it a couple times to really get the hang of it. But once you do get the hang of it, it's pretty insane. You can do a lot during your opponent's turn. You can move the Incarn around. You can Lethal Intent. You know, and that's on top of things that you already had access to, like Overwatch, Battle Focus, stuff like that. So it's a really interesting army to play on the battlefield. Truthfully, it's not my favorite detachment. I'll just say that. I think it's strong for a reason. And I think that a lot of its strength comes from just the obvious power of Lethal Intent. And not a lot else. I'll be honest. The stratagems are just okay. Emissaries of Ynnead is very good for rerolling ones to hit, but you know, it's something that's a little bit hard to come by because remember, you lack CP in this detachment, so most of the time you're going to be using that on things like Howling banshees. I think also the fight on death, you know, is really good, but again, the problem with that, it's situational. It requires you to go against a combat army that's going to be, you know, really hitting you hard and hitting your combat units at that, because you definitely don't want to fight on death with like fire dragons. The one where the Ynnari get to shoot back at your opponent is only if the unit survives. So you have to survive to be able to use that attack. And again, it's one of those things where it's cool, but we have a lot of squishy units in this army. Not a lot is going to be able to survive, right? So the stratagems are good, but they're not out of this world good. I don't think they're as good as the Seer Council stratagems. And really a lot of the power comes from the army ability. So being able to use that army ability to your advantage is going to be really important. Now, one last thing that I want to kind of show you guys before we end today's video. I know I keep saying one more thing, but again, with Ynnari, it's like there's always one more thing to think about. Remember how we had these striking scorpions here? Well, if your opponent decides to shoot something like a scout sentinel at them first to give everything rerolls ones to hit against it, which Imperial Guard players love to do, right? They love to set it up with a Scout Sentinel and then blow the unit away with a tank so that they don't miss, right? Well, what you could actually do in this case is you could just lethal surge. So remember, the Ynnari have an ability that you could use fade away, right? The fade, or fade back, excuse me, the fade back battle focus maneuver to get into combat. So if your opponent does that, you could just move into combat. Now, if your opponent doesn't do it, they're not re-rolling ones to hit, and striking scorpions have stealth. So your Imperial Guard, you know, tanks are hitting on 4s. 4s are extremely swingy. I've played people before where I've had scorpions with stealth and against my Imperial Guard buddy, and he has a tank company like this, right? It's not exactly like this, obviously, but it's similar. And he was, you know, shooting his Leman Russ tank commander at these guys, and they survived. Not only did they survive, but they were able to get to safety because he didn't have the tanks this close. But they were able to get to safety as a result. If your opponent does move closer, then you can get into combat, right? So this is a really bad position for your opponent. Like, your opponent's just forced into so many bad positions in this game. It's really funny to see. It's kind of like, you know, the lore friendly, because Imperial Guard would be very outclassed by you know, an Eldar army strategy wise, right? Because the Eldar are much more strategic than the Imperial Guard, and they would probably do something. They'd probably do something like this, where they just moved forward all their tanks, you know, like for the Emperor, you know, and just drove forward with their treads. But the Eldari would just absolutely obliterate these tanks. Like, they'd come out here, and then we would just have fire dragons just cleaning everything up. So yeah, that's funny. All right, guys, that is going to be it for our example on Tabletop Simulator. Hopefully some of those maneuvers kind of helped you understand how to maneuver or move your army and stuff like that, and kind of what to look out for. We will be talking about, you know, other types of lists in a series. So we're going to do a series on this, you know, how to create a winning Eldari list for Seer Council and for other detachments as well. And if you guys want to see that, let me know, and we can continue that series. But, you know, people were asking me about Ynnari and also Seer Council, so we're going to probably do Seer Council next, which actually Seer Council is my favorite detachment, so I'm excited for that one. All right, guys, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching. Thank you so much to all my supporters and Patreon members who have supported the channel over the last 2.5 years plus. Your help has really been appreciated, and it's helped the channel grow significantly. If you do want to join the Patreon and help support the channel, I have free trials activated, which will grant you permanent access to the Discord community. And if you want a little bit of extra assistance, you know, list building help, quote-unquote coaching, if you want me to get on Tabletop Simulator and help you out with your army list and how to maneuver your army and stuff like that, whatever you're taking, I'm more than happy to do that. Just become a Patreon member and hit me up, and I'll be sure to say hello. Lastly, I do have a channel store page with Eldar inspired apparel and an Amazon affiliate link. Check those out if you want some discounted Eldar minis or discounted Eldar apparel on the store page. All right, guys, have a good one, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out, everybody. See you later.